The mother bear's actions became more frantic, more deliberate. She alternated between checking her weakening cubs and returning to the window, each time making gestures that seemed eerily human-like in their desperation. Jaren watched in disbelief as the mother bear did something that defied all natural laws. She sat back on her haunches, raised both paws in what could only be described as a prayer position, and held them there. Her eyes, filled with an intelligence that seemed impossible for a wild animal, locked onto Jaren's face. The message was unmistakable. She was begging for help. The second cub stumbled and fell, its strength failing in the lethal cold. The third pressed against its mother's leg, making soft whimpering sounds that carried clearly through the thick glass. The mother bear's response stunned Jaren into complete stillness. She gathered snow in her paw and began making deliberate marks on his window, movements so precise they almost looked like attempts at writing. Emergency weather alerts blared from Jaren's phone, warning of even colder temperatures approaching. The mother bear's begging grew more urgent, more desperate. She picked up each cub in turn, showing them to Jaren through the window, her actions screaming of a mother's desperation to save her children. The smallest cub had stopped shivering entirely, a deadly sign that hypothermia had taken hold. In all his years living in Montana, Jaren had never witnessed anything like this. Bears were supposed to be deep in hibernation, not begging at his door in the middle of winter. Whatever had driven this family from their den must have been catastrophic. As he stood frozen in his living room, watching this impossible scene unfold, the mother bear made one final heart-wrenching attempt to communicate. She pressed her paw against the window, leaving a perfect print in the frost, and made a sound that wasn't a growl or a roar but something that sounded remarkably like a plea. The mother bear's begging escalated to levels that made Jaren question everything he knew about wild animals. She began a series of actions so deliberate, so calculated, that they seemed impossible for a creature of pure instinct. Standing fully upright, she pressed both paws against the window in a perfect mirror of human hands begging for mercy. Her eyes, filled with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural, never left Jaren's face. The smallest cub's condition grew more desperate with each passing minute, its tiny body lying motionless in the snow, barely breathing. The mother bear's response to her dying cub's state shattered every preconception about wild animal behavior. She gently scooped up her weakest baby, held it directly against the window, and made soft whimpering sounds that seemed to say, "Please, my child is dying." The gesture was so human-like, so heartbreaking, that Jaren felt tears freezing on his cheeks. The other two cubs joined their mother's desperate plea. The middle cub, though barely able to stand, raised its small paw to the window, mimicking its mother's begging gesture. The largest cub pressed itself against the glass, its warm breath creating small circles of frost that quickly crystallized in the lethal cold. Their coordinated behavior seemed impossible, yet Jaren watched it unfold before his eyes. As the temperature plunged even lower, the mother bear's begging took on a new dimension. She began making patterns in the snow with her palm, creating deliberate marks that looked eerily like crude symbols. After each mark, she would look at Jaren, point to her cubs, then repeat the process. The sequence was so purposeful that it could only be an attempt at communication. The desperation in her movements grew more pronounced as her cubs showed increasing signs of distress. The middle cub collapsed next, its strength finally giving out. The mother bear's reaction was immediate and shocking. She gathered both fallen cubs close to her body, trying to warm them while continuing to beg at the window. Her largest cub, still barely standing, pressed its face against the glass and made a sound that would haunt Jaren forever. It wasn't a growl or a typical bear vocalization. It was a cry for help that sounded almost human. Time was running out. The mother bear, seeming to sense this, made one final desperate attempt to convince Jaren. She laid her weakest cub gently in the snow, then performed a series of gestures that defied explanation. She pointed to Jaren's door, made a clear opening motion with her paws, then bowed her head in complete submission. The message was unmistakable. She was placing her family's fate entirely in his hands. The brutal wind drove sheets of snow against the windows, and the cub's movements grew weaker by the second. The mother bear's begging became a heartbreaking dance of desperation. She alternated between trying to warm her cubs and pleading at the window, each movement more urgent than the last. Her eyes held such clear intelligence, such obvious understanding of her situation, that Jaren felt his grip on reality slipping. As the smallest cub stopped moving entirely, the mother bear made her final, shocking plea. She pressed her forehead against the window, raised both paws in a prayer-like gesture, and let out a sound that seemed to carry all the anguish of a mother watching her children freeze to death. The remaining conscious cub copied its mother's gesture, creating an image so surreal that Jaren had to grab his counter for support. Jaren stood at his window, his heart pounding against his ribs, knowing that his next decision would change everything. The mother bear's eyes met his one final time, holding a desperate question that demanded an immediate answer. What happened next would become the most extraordinary human-animal encounter ever recorded. Driven by a force stronger than fear, Jaren slowly approached his front door. The mother bear watched his every move, her eyes showing an understanding that seemed impossible for a wild animal. As his hand touched the doorknob, time itself seemed to pause. Then came the moment that would shock everyone who would later witness it on Jaren's security cameras. The door creaked open just enough to reach the smallest cub, but before Jaren could move, the mother bear did something that defied all natural laws. She carefully picked up her weakest cub, approached the door with slow, deliberate steps, and, with movements that showed impossible restraint, gently placed her baby just inside the threshold. She then backed away, bowed her head, and waited. This wasn't just unusual behavior. This was something that would force scientists to rewrite everything they knew about wild animal intelligence. Inside the warmth of the house, the nearly frozen cub began to stir. What happened next left Jaren rooted to the spot in absolute shock. The mother bear, instead of charging in after her cub, made a series of gestures, pointing to her other two cubs, then to the door, all while maintaining a respectful distance. Her actions were so clearly communicative that Jaren found himself nodding without even realizing it. When Jaren opened the door wider, the mother bear's behavior grew even more astonishing. She guided her remaining cubs toward the door with gentle nudges, keeping them in a perfectly straight line. As each cub crossed the threshold, she made them pause and wait, showing a level of control that seemed impossible for wild animals. But the truly shocking moment came when she herself prepared to enter. The massive bear stopped at the doorway and did something that would later be viewed millions of times online. She carefully wiped her paws in the snow, removed as much ice as possible from her fur, and then looked at Jaren as if asking permission. This display of awareness and respect for human space was so extraordinary that Jaren nearly forgot to breathe. When he stepped aside, she entered with a delicacy that seemed impossible for a creature her size. Once inside, the bear's behavior became even more remarkable. The mother bear immediately gathered her cubs into the corner furthest from Jaren, creating minimal disturbance to his home. She then did something that would later make wildlife experts question everything they thought they knew about bear intelligence. She found a fallen blanket, picked it up with surprising gentleness, and wrapped it around her shivering cubs, displaying an understanding of human objects that should have been impossible. But the most shocking display was yet to come. As warmth began returning to her cubs' bodies, the mother bear turned her attention to Jaren's home. Instead of showing any aggression or wild behavior, she began actively keeping her cubs away from his furniture and belongings. When the middle cub stumbled toward a bookshelf, she gently redirected it with a soft sound that seemed almost like a mother's whispered warning. The level of awareness she showed was beyond extraordinary. She appeared to understand not just that she was in a human dwelling, but how to behave appropriately within it. She kept her family contained to a small area, made no attempts to explore or forage, and, most incredibly, maintained constant eye contact with Jaren as if checking that each of her actions met with his approval. As the cubs began to recover, their behavior proved equally shocking. Instead of becoming more energetic or destructive as they warmed up, they followed their mother's example perfectly. They stayed where she placed them, made no loud sounds, and showed none of the wild behavior one would expect from young bears. Their coordination and restraint seemed to suggest an intelligence far beyond what anyone thought possible in bear cubs. Inside Jaren's warm living room, The scene continued to unfold in ways that left him questioning everything he knew about wild animals. The mother bear's behavior grew even more astonishing with each passing moment. Instead of spreading through the house or searching for food, she maintained her family in a neat, organized group near the fireplace, demonstrating an awareness of human space that seemed impossible. The most shocking moment came when Jaren's cat, Nimbus, emerged from hiding under the couch. Everyone in the room froze, expecting the worst, but what happened next left Jaren stunned beyond words. The mother bear gently pulled her cubs closer and made a soft rumbling sound. To Jaren's amazement, the cubs sat perfectly still, watching the cat with curious but unthreatening eyes. The mother bear then did something extraordinary. She lowered her head to the cat's level and remained motionless, as if trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. As the cubs regained their strength, their behavior defied every natural instinct. Rather than becoming more energetic or destructive, they remained remarkably calm. When one cub accidentally knocked over a small vase, the mother bear immediately picked it up and, in a gesture that would later be studied by wildlife experts worldwide, attempted to place it back exactly where it had been. Her understanding of human belongings and her desire to respect them was unprecedented. Jaren watched in absolute amazement as the mother bear began what appeared to be a cleanup routine. She gathered her cubs, shed ice and snow into a neat pile, used fallen newspapers to wipe up watermarks from their wet paws, and kept checking Jaren's reaction to ensure her actions met with his approval. This wasn't just intelligent behavior, this was something that would challenge our entire understanding of wild animal consciousness. The cubs, now fully warmed, showed equally shocking awareness. They mimicked their mother's careful movements, avoided touching furniture, and maintained what could only be described as perfect guest behavior. When Jaren cautiously offered them water in a bowl, they waited for their mother's permission before drinking, then carefully avoided spilling any on his floor. But perhaps the most astonishing moment came when Jaren's phone rang. Instead of being startled or aggressive, the mother bear calmly gathered her cubs closer and waited until the noise stopped. She then did something that made Jaren question his own sanity. She pointed to the phone, then to herself, then to the door, as if communicating that it was time for them to leave before more humans arrived. The intelligence displayed in this simple gesture was mind-boggling. Not only had she recognized the phone as a communication device, but she had also understood that it might mean more human presence. This level of comprehension and reasoning would later become the subject of countless wildlife behavior studies. As the cubs showed signs of complete recovery, the mother bear began preparing for their departure. Her actions continued to shock Jaren. She guided her cubs to the door, but first ensured they hadn't left any mess behind. Each cub was made to wipe its paws on the mat, a behavior so human-like that Jaren had to remind himself he was watching wild bears. What happened next would become the most watched wildlife video of the year. As the mother bear prepared her family to leave, she orchestrated a farewell scene that left Jaren questioning everything he thought he knew about wild animals. Standing at his front door, she did something that would shock millions of viewers worldwide. She lined up her cubs in a perfect row and began what could only be described as a goodbye ceremony. The smallest cub, now fully recovered, stepped forward first, following its mother's gentle guidance. It placed its paw over its heart, then extended it toward Jaren in a gesture so deliberate it could not be mistaken for anything else. The middle cub followed, adding a small bow to its farewell. The largest cub completed its goodbye with a soft whimper that sounded remarkably like an attempt at human gratitude. But it was the mother bear's final gesture that would leave Jaren speechless. She approached him with slow, careful movements, maintaining perfect eye contact. Then, in a display that would challenge every known principle of wild animal behavior, she placed her massive paw gently on his arm for just a moment. The gesture carried such clear meaning, such obvious gratitude, that Jaren felt tears welling in his eyes. She then backed away respectfully, never turning her back, showing a level of etiquette that seemed impossible for a wild animal. Before leaving, the mother bear did one final thing that would be analyzed by wildlife experts for years to come. She carefully cleaned the doorway where they had entered, using fallen snow to wipe away any marks their paws had left. Then she gathered her cubs close and, with movements that showed remarkable awareness, began their exit. Each cub stepped carefully over his doormat, avoiding tracking any snow back into the house. As they prepared to leave, the mother bear turned one last time. Her eyes met Jaren's with an intelligence that would forever change his understanding of wildlife. She raised her paw in what could only be described as a wave, and to Jaren's utter amazement, each cub copied their mother's gesture. This coordinated farewell display was so shocking, so seemingly impossible, that Jaren had to grab his door frame for support. The family's departure was as orderly as their entire visit had been. The mother bear kept her cubs in a tight formation, moving away from the house with deliberate care. They didn't rush into the woods or scatter in different directions. Instead, they maintained a dignified pace, occasionally looking back at Jaren, their behavior continuing to defy every wild animal instinct. Jaren stood in his doorway, watching this extraordinary family disappear into the snowy forest. His entire understanding of wildlife had been transformed in the span of a few hours. The bears hadn't just sought shelter. They had displayed a level of intelligence, gratitude, and respect that would force humans to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about wild animals. As the last bear disappeared into the trees, Jaren looked at his perfectly clean, undisturbed living room. If it weren't for his security cameras capturing every moment, he might have thought he had imagined the whole thing. The only evidence of their visit was a single perfect paw print left in the snow outside his door, a final reminder of the most extraordinary encounter of his life. Want to discover more extraordinary stories that will leave you amazed? Subscribe now and join thousands of readers who receive our most captivating stories straight to their inbox. One click is all it takes to never miss another incredible tale. Click the subscribe button below and be part of our journey of discovery.